The launch of Red Bull's 2026 livery yesterday was not just a visual ceremony. It was a declaration that Red Bull Powertrains is finally ready to enter the arena, the most high-risk engineering project this team has ever undertaken. But at the very moment it became real, Christian Horner, the architect behind it all, was no longer at Red Bull, and that turns this launch from a celebration into a live stress test of his strategic legacy. Back in 2021, Horner described the project as, by far the biggest challenge we've taken on in Formula One. He knew this was not simply about building an engine, but about constructing an entirely new organisation from scratch, recruiting Ben Hodgkinson from Mercedes, assembling elite hybrid engineers, and building Red Bull Powertrains with no guarantees of competitiveness in the early years. As he put it himself, this was Red Bull's way to take our destiny completely into our own hands, but that also meant absorbing the full technical and reputational risk if it failed. Now the RB22 has been unveiled, Laurent Mekies is executing the structure Horner built, and Max Verstappen is the face of the project. But Horner is gone. What remains is the system he designed, and that system has never been tested in live competition. The question is no longer whether Red Bull Powertrains can succeed, but how costly failure would be if it falls short of expectations in 2026. So will Red Bull Powertrains become Christian Horner's final masterpiece, or the strategic decision that accelerated Red Bull's decline in Formula One's next era? Stay with us to find out. And if you want more deep dive F1 analysis without the noise, consider subscribing. To understand how Red Bull reached this point, you have to go back to late 2021, when Honda's withdrawal forced the team into a structural crossroads. Red Bull could either revert to being a customer outfit or attempt something no modern independent team had seriously pursued, building its own power unit operation from scratch. Horner framed that moment as an opportunity rather than a crisis. "We felt this was a once-in-a-generation chance," he said. "It gives us control over our destiny and over the long-term competitiveness of the team." But he was also clear-eyed about the scale of the task. "We're not naive," he added. "This is a long-term project." The first critical move was recruiting Ben Hodgkinson, Mercedes' head of mechanical engineering on the power unit side, to lead the new division. Hodgkinson described joining as the most exciting and terrifying decision of my career, noting that there was no factory, no dynos, and no infrastructure in place. "We were starting from nothing," he said. "That's incredibly rare in modern Formula One." Horner then backed Hodgkinson with aggressive hiring across the paddock, attracting experienced engineers from Mercedes, Ferrari, Renault, and Honda. The goal was not simply to copy an existing manufacturer model, but to create a structure that integrated power unit and chassis development more tightly than any customer team could manage. "The big advantage," Horner explained, "is having engine engineers sitting next to chassis engineers. That's something no customer team can do." That integration philosophy became central to the project, especially as the 2026 regulations came into focus. With a 50-50 split between combustion and electrical power, simplified turbo architecture and tight fuel flow constraints, the next-generation power units represent the biggest technical reset since 2014. Horner saw it as the ideal moment to make such a structural leap. "If you're ever going to do something like this," he said, "you do it at the start of a regulation cycle." But the risks were obvious. Red Bull had no legacy in power unit manufacturing, no combustion research history, and no proven development pipeline. Horner never pretended otherwise. "This is by far the biggest challenge we've taken on," he said. "There will be difficult days." Those difficulties arrived quickly when the planned partnership with Porsche collapsed in 2022 over governance and control. Red Bull was suddenly committed to building an engine without a major manufacturer partner. Horner moved fast, securing a deal with Ford in early 2023 that positioned the American brand as a technical and commercial partner rather than a controlling stakeholder. "They bring areas of expertise we don't have," Horner said, "but crucially, they don't want to run the team." Inside the paddock, that pivot was seen as both pragmatic and revealing. Red Bull gained software and electrification expertise while retaining operational autonomy, something Horner had long insisted was non-negotiable. As one rival engineer privately put it, "Either it's visionary or it's reckless. We won't know which until 2026. Hodgkinson has consistently avoided inflating expectations. "We're not expecting to come out and dominate," he said. "We're going up against organizations that have been doing this for decades." But he has also stressed that Red Bull Powertrains' unique strength lies in its blank sheet approach. "We can design the power unit around our car, not the other way around. That's a rare opportunity." Horner echoed that realism. "If anyone expects us to suddenly outperform Mercedes or Ferrari, that's not realistic," he said. "Our aim is to build something competitive, robust, and scalable." Yet Red Bull's recent dominance with Max Verstappen has recalibrated expectations. Anything less than championship contention risks being framed not as a development phase, but as failure. That tension is what makes Horner's absence now so significant. For 2 decades, he was Red Bull's political shield, absorbing pressure from shareholders, sponsors, rivals, and media, while insulating the technical departments from destabilizing noise. One former senior figure described him as the buffer zone between chaos and the factory. Without him, the question is whether Red Bull Powertrains will receive the same organizational patience if early results fall short. Laurent Mekies, now overseeing operations, has emphasized continuity. "The structure is in place, the people are in place, and the roadmap is clear," he said. "This isn't about changing direction. It's about executing what's already been built." That framing reveals how deeply Horner's imprint remains embedded in the organization. This is not Mekies' engine project. It is Horner's, inherited at the most fragile stage of its life cycle. Historically, early deficits in new engine eras have been brutally difficult to overcome. Mercedes' advantage in 2014 reshaped the sport for years, despite rivals spending vast sums to close the gap. Red Bull knows this better than most, having endured seasons of structural disadvantage during the early hybrid era. Horner acknowledged that reality openly. "We've lived through what it's like to have the wrong engine at the start of a regulation cycle," he said. "We know how damaging that can be." That is precisely why Red Bull Powertrains represents such a high-stakes bet. On one hand, the organizational foundations are formidable. A modern power unit facility embedded within one of Formula One's most advanced chassis operations, technical leadership drawn from championship-winning hybrid programs, and a partnership with Ford that strengthens software and electrification capability. On the other, none of that guarantees combustion efficiency, energy deployment sophistication, or reliability at the level required to fight Ferrari, Mercedes, Audi, or Honda-backed projects in 2026. Beyond performance, there is also a deeper strategic dimension. Red Bull Powertrains was not simply about engines, it was about power within Formula One's political economy. Owning its power unit gives Red Bull leverage in regulatory negotiations, supplier relationships, and long-term planning. Horner understood that leverage intimately. "Control equals resilience," he said, "and resilience is what keeps you competitive when the sport changes." That philosophy now faces its first real test. If Red Bull Powertrains succeeds, it validates Horner's belief that structural independence outweighs short-term risk and elevates Red Bull into the rare category of organizations that can win championships while designing both chassis and power unit in-house. If it fails, the consequences extend far beyond lap times. It would undermine Red Bull's competitive leverage, destabilize its relationship with Verstappen, and raise uncomfortable questions about whether the team overreached strategically. What makes this moment unusual is that Horner will not be the one judged in real time as those consequences unfold. Instead, Red Bull Powertrains becomes a delayed referendum on his leadership, a verdict delivered not in press conferences or boardrooms but on the stopwatch. Horner seemed acutely aware of that risk. "This is one of those decisions that will define the team for a decade," he said. "You don't make it lightly, and you don't make it without accepting that it could go wrong." Which brings us back to the RB22 launch. On the surface, it was about a new livery and a new era. Beneath that, it was about whether a structure conceived under one leader can thrive under another, and whether strategic courage can outlast the individual who embodied it. Red Bull Powertrains is not simply Red Bull's engine program. It is Christian Horner's thesis about how modern Formula One teams should be built. Integrated, autonomous, and structurally independent from manufacturers whose priorities may not always align with racing success. The next few seasons will determine whether that thesis was correct, or whether it underestimated the brutal complexity of power unit competition at the elite level. So here's the real question. Was Red Bull Powertrains the boldest and smartest move of Horner's career? Or the gamble that finally exposed the limits of Red Bull's organizational model? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.